By the final week of October, Nora Bennett could smell the loss before she saw it. The old barn held the first potato crop she had ever grown. Hundreds of pounds rested in burlap sacks and shallow wooden crates beneath the patched metal roof. Only a few days earlier, the potatoes had been firm and clean. Now moisture beaded on the walls, pale shoots pushed from several tubers, and a sour odor rose from the sacks nearest the floor. Nora opened another bag. 2 potatoes had softened into wet brown pulp. 3 more carried dark spots beneath the skin. The temperature outside was unusually warm for northern Maine. Sunlight heated the barn during the day, but the temperature dropped sharply each night. Every change left more condensation on the roof and walls. Nora moved the damaged sacks outside and spread the remaining potatoes across the sorting table. She had already lost part of the harvest. Unless she found somewhere cooler and more stable, she could lose the rest within days. Behind the barn, a narrow white line remained on the grass. It was frost. The morning sun had melted every other patch across the farm, yet the strip beside the rocky hill was still white. Nora followed it through blackberry canes and waist-high weeds until she reached a sunken section of ground. Cold air moved across her hands. She pushed aside the branches and found 2 vertical stone walls hidden beneath the brush. Between them lay a rotting timber and several boards almost completely buried by soil. Nora pulled one board free. A black opening appeared behind it. The air that came from the darkness was cold enough to fog faintly against the warm afternoon light. If you enjoy stories about abandoned farms, forgotten structures, and people who find value where everyone else sees failure, subscribe and join us. Sometimes the most important part of a property is the part nobody remembers is there. 5 months earlier, Nora had attended a county tax sale with $7,000 and almost nothing left beyond it. For years, she had managed the produce section of a small grocery store. She understood bruising, spoilage, temperature changes, and the narrow difference between a vegetable that sold and one that went into the waste bin. When the store closed, she decided to try growing food instead of watching other people's crops arrive in boxes. The abandoned potato farm covered about 11 acres in Aroostook County. It included a leaning barn, a rusted trailer, an old sorting table, and a field buried beneath weeds. Nobody else bid. George Palmer, the former owner, met Nora at the property a week later. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with a grey mustache and the tired patience of someone who had watched the same land disappoint several owners. He told Nora the soil could still grow potatoes. Then he pointed toward the barn. Growing them was never the expensive part, he said. Keeping them long enough to sell was. Several neighboring farmers laughed when Nora began repairing the roof. They knew she had no refrigerated warehouse, no large buyer, and no equipment beyond an old Turo planter and a borrowed tractor. Nora did not answer them. At that time, she believed the barn could become a storage building. She had not yet discovered the door inside the hill. Nora began with only a few acres. She cleared the field slowly, removed stones by hand, repaired the old planter, and purchased enough seed potatoes for a modest crop. The soil was uneven and the equipment unreliable, but by early summer green rose covered the land behind the barn. Her first mistake came before harvest. Nora assumed the barn would stay cool because Maine nights were cold. She patched holes in the walls, replaced several roof panels, and sealed the widest gaps around the doors. The work kept rain outside. It also trapped warm air inside. During sunny days, heat collected beneath the metal roof. At night, cold air condensed moisture against the boards. The building shifted from warm and dry to cold and damp every 24 hours. When harvest began, Nora stored the potatoes in sacks because they were inexpensive and easy to stack. She arranged them along the barn walls and installed 2 used electric fans. For a few days, the potatoes appeared safe. Then one fan stopped working. The second pushed air across only the nearest sacks. Moisture collected in the lower corners where the walls touched the earth. Nora closed more gaps, believing outside humidity was entering the barn. The problem grew worse. Without enough fresh air, the barn became heavy and damp. Several sacks warmed from the combined heat of the potatoes themselves. Pale shoots began appearing. A few tubers developed soft black patches. Nora opened the doors and moved the sacks again. She calculated the cost of renting space in a commercial refrigerated warehouse. The storage fee was high, but transportation made it worse. The nearest available facility was far enough away that fuel and handling would consume most of what she might earn. George offered a simpler solution: sell everything immediately. The order market was crowded with potatoes from larger farms. Buyers knew small growers had nowhere to keep their crops, so the price was low. Nora could recover some expenses, but nearly all the work of planting and harvesting would lead to almost no profit. That was when she understood why the farm had been abandoned. The land was capable of producing food. The business failed after the food came out of the ground. Nora sold part of the crop at the low autumn price. She kept the rest in the barn, hoping the weather would cool quickly enough to save it. Instead, an unusually warm spell arrived. The temperature rose during the day. Moisture covered the walls. The smell of decay appeared near the lowest sacks. Nora began sorting the potatoes twice a day, removing anything soft before the damage spread. Even with careful work, the pile continued shrinking. Then she noticed the frost behind the barn. The white strip led directly toward the buried doorway. Nora cleared branches until the old entrance became visible. The wooden door had collapsed inward, and soil covered its lower half. She removed boards one at a time, careful not to disturb the stones above them. Beyond the entrance, a narrow passage descended into the hill. The air inside was cold. For the first time since harvest began, Nora stood somewhere on the farm where the temperature did not change when the sun passed overhead. Nora entered with a flashlight. The passage opened into a long underground room supported by stone walls and heavy timber beams. The ceiling curved beneath the hill, and old wooden bins lined both sides. Most had collapsed. Their boards broke apart when Nora touched them. Several inches of water covered the lowest section of the floor. Roots hung from cracks in the ceiling. Mud blocked a narrow drain near the entrance, and pale mold covered the wall farthest from the door. Yet the room remained cool. George remembered hearing about it as a child. His grandfather had called it the potato house. Before mechanical refrigeration became common, the family stored potatoes inside the hill, using earth for insulation and outside air for temperature control. A partial roof collapse had buried the entrance decades earlier. Later owners rented warehouse space and stopped maintaining the old structure. Nora could not afford a full restoration. She inspected the beams and found that most remained solid, but one section near the entrance had weakened. She braced it temporarily, cleared the floor drain, and moved debris away from the walls. Water began leaving the lowest corner. Nora built simple wooden pallets and carried several crates of potatoes into the room. She placed them above the floor, left space between the stacks, and closed the repaired entrance as tightly as possible. Her first test failed. 4 days later, the air inside felt colder than the barn, but also heavier. Droplets covered the ceiling. The potatoes nearest the damp wall had become wet, and the lower crates smelled sour. Nora had preserved the cold and trapped the moisture. She removed the damaged potatoes and opened the entrance. The room had no working air movement. Using her flashlight, Nora searched the ceiling and walls. Near the floor, she found a narrow stone-lined opening packed with leaves and soil. At the back of the room, another shaft climbed upward through the hill. Both had been designed to move air. The lower opening admitted cold air. The upper shaft allowed warmer, moist air to escape. Roots had blocked the upper passage, while the lower one had filled with dirt. Nora cleaned them carefully. When the second shaft opened, air began moving through the room. It was not a strong breeze, but a slow, steady circulation. She placed thermometers near the entrance, the center, and the wet wall. She also hung simple humidity gauges at different heights. The readings showed that the storage room was not uniform. One corner remained too damp. The center stayed cooler and drier. The area nearest the entrance changed temperature more quickly than the back. Nora moved the crates into the safer section and left the wet corner empty. The old room had not offered her a perfect refrigerator. It had offered her a system she still needed to understand. Nora rebuilt the storage room in small stages. She replaced only the damaged beams. She dug a shallow channel outside the entrance so rainwater could not flow toward the door. She raised every crate above the floor and left wide spaces between the stacks. The 2 ventilation openings received simple wooden shutters. At night, when the outside air cooled, Nora opened the lower vent and allowed cold air into the room. Warmer air rose through the upper shaft. During mild days, she reduced the opening so the room would not absorb unnecessary heat or moisture. The first cold snap created another problem. Nora left both vents open through the night. By morning, the temperature inside had fallen dangerously close to freezing. Potatoes damaged by freezing might appear normal at first, then soften and darken when warmed. Nora closed the lower vent and moved the crates away from the incoming air. Several potatoes near the opening had become too cold, but most of the crop survived. She added a simple routine. Every morning and evening, she recorded the temperature and humidity in a notebook. She checked the potatoes by hand, looking for moisture, soft spots, and unusual warmth inside each crate. She stopped using deep sacks. Instead, she built shallow wooden bins with gaps between the boards. Air could pass around the potatoes, and a damaged tuber was easier to find before it affected the rest. The true test arrived during another warm week. Outside temperatures climbed well above the seasonal average. The barn heated rapidly, and the potatoes Nora had left there for comparison began growing long pale shoots. Inside the hill, the temperature rose only slightly. The earth surrounding the chamber slowed the change. The ventilation allowed moisture to escape without exposing the crop to the full warmth of the afternoon. Not everything worked. 2 crates near the wet wall developed mold. Nora discarded the damaged potatoes and permanently stopped using that section. A heavy rain filled the entrance drain with leaves, forcing her to clear it before water reached the storage floor. The old beams required inspection after every storm. The vents needed adjustment when the weather changed. The room could not simply be filled and forgotten, but most of the remaining crop stayed firm. By the beginning of winter, Nora still had potatoes to sell. That single fact changed the value of the farm. She no longer had to accept the lowest price during the busiest weeks of harvest. She could wait until local supplies became smaller and customers began looking for vegetables grown nearby. The underground room had not increased the size of the crop. It had increased the amount of time Nora could choose when to sell it. In December, Nora loaded the first winter crates into her old pickup. The local market was quieter than it had been during harvest season. Many large farms had already shipped their potatoes to distant distributors. Small stores and restaurants still needed produce, but fewer local growers had anything left. Nora's potatoes were firm, clean, and stored only a few miles away. She earned more per crate than she could have received in autumn. The difference was not enormous, but it was enough to matter. The following year, Nora did not plant the entire field. She measured the storage capacity first and grew only what the underground room could safely hold. She added carrots and beets, placing each crop in separate sections because they required different conditions. She accepted small amounts of produce from neighboring farmers, but only when she had enough space and could inspect every crate. Some losses remained unavoidable. A few potatoes sprouted early. One section of carrots dried too much near the air inlet. After a wet autumn, the wall drain required repeated cleaning. Nora never claimed the old cellar could preserve everything perfectly. It reduced waste and extended the selling season. That was enough. She repaired the barn and used it for washing, sorting, and packing. During winter, she assembled boxes containing potatoes, carrots, beets, and onions from nearby farms. Local families collected them every few weeks, and several cafes began ordering directly. The farm developed a small but dependable winter income. George returned during the 3rd season. Nora opened the heavy door and led him into the hill. Rows of shallow crates stood on raised wooden supports. Air moved quietly between them. Thermometers hung from the beams, and the damp corner remained empty. George looked around the room his family had forgotten. He had believed the property's value ended when the crop came out of the soil. Nora had learned that part of its value began afterward. Several months later, she received an offer to sell the farm for many times the $7,000 she had paid. The buyer saw productive ground, a repaired barn, and a working underground storage facility. Nora declined. The farm still had limits. The ceiling needed regular inspection. Ventilation had to be adjusted by hand. Heavy rain could flood the entrance. The room could not be packed too tightly. Some crops lasted longer than others, and a small part of every harvest still spoiled. The cellar did not create a good crop from a bad one. It gave a good crop more time. At the end of winter, Nora carried the final empty crates from a chamber. She checked the beams, cleared the drain, and left the door open for fresh air before the next season. Outside, snow covered the abandoned field she had purchased years earlier. The barn stood straight again, and next year's seed potatoes waited in the coolest part of the underground room. Nora closed the heavy wooden door. There had been no gold beneath the hill and no buried fortune. What the old farmers had left behind was something quieter and more practical. They had built a place where autumn could wait for winter. And on a farm where the lowest price arrived with the harvest, those extra months were worth far more than the $7,000 Nora had paid for the land.